Hi, everyone, and welcome back. This is Alexander Lim, and welcome to AuthorStory. Our featured book for this episode is The Seven Deadly Sins: How Sin Influenced the West from the Middle Ages to the Modern Era, which you can check out by clicking on the Amazon link in the video description below. Dr. David A. Salomon is the author and our guest, and he is the Director of Undergraduate and Creative Activity at the Christopher Newport University in Virginia, and has been teaching English, religion, philosophy for over 30 years. So, Dr. Salomon, welcome to Author Story. Thank you for being with us.
Great to be with you. Thanks so much.
Right. So, to start off with, I'm sure a lot of us, particularly those who raised the Christian faith, we're familiar with the so-called seven deadly sins. I mean, this is a part of religious upbringing. In your case, what is the first time that you encountered this concept?
Well, I mean, the concept of sin, of course, I encountered as a young boy. I was raised Jewish in the Bronx, New York.
Okay.
And sin is, of course, mentioned in Hebrew school education. The concept of the seven deadly sins, though, didn't really come into my own purview until I was in college at Fordham University, a Jesuit Catholic institution, where I took a Foundations of Catholic Theology course freshman year.
Okay. So, like, before that time, to you, sin was just, sin, generic, something
Right.
generic.
Right, really not delineated in any specific kind of way.
All right, okay. And what drew you into investigating this concept and essentially the impact on its society and culture?
Well, I've written quite a bit on the history of Christianity and the history of religion, particularly in the Middle Ages and the English Renaissance. And that's really where most of my work was taking place. I was in the process, and still am in the process, of working on a larger project that looks at concepts of the self in St. Augustine and then comparing that with the same thing in the 20th century psychologist Carl Jung.
Right.
I was working on that project, and it really became evident to me that what's happened over the course of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century is a heightened awareness of our behavior in a negative sense. And what I mean by that is a real change and a morph from looking at concepts of sin in a strictly religious context and moving it more into a secular context.
Okay, all right. So before anything else, how did the book come about? The Seven Deadly Sins I got that you did research. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I spent a year doing reading and research and background material, and then I spent one solid year actually writing the book last year, which was my first year at a new job here at Christopher Newport University. So it was an interesting year of changes. But so the whole project was 2 years.
Okay. But, what made you decide to write the book? I mean, did you decide to write like, maybe I should write this book, or did it just like come to you like, in an aha moment, like this is something I should write?
Yeah, in one way it did. I had written something for ABC Clio, the publisher, that was included in an earlier book. It was an essay, and the editor of that volume had sent me a list of things that they were looking for books about, and one of them was a history of sin. And she said she thought that would be a good project for me, knowing my background. And quite honestly, I was working at the time, as I say, on this Augustine and Jung project. And at first I said, no, I don't think I really want to do that right now.
Right.
And I was literally sitting in my office one day, and I did have that aha moment. I was rereading a passage in Augustine's Confessions in the scene where he steals the peaches. And I did have that kind of aha moment. I can remember quite vividly sending my wife a message on Facebook Messenger saying, you know what, I think I want to write that book on sin.
Oh, okay. All right, cool. And of course, we're here right now with the book out and all that stuff. All right, so great.
Right.
All right. So, we've got AuthorStory. We've got a listenership all over the world. So, not all of our listeners are familiar with this. So, for the benefit of those of us who aren't familiar, what are each of the seven sins and what are these all about?
Sure. So the seven deadly sins is a concept which was really formulated by Gregory the Great in the 4th century. It was based on earlier delineations and lists of sins, but Gregory is the one who really came up with these 7. And when we talk about the concept of quote unquote the 7 deadly sins today, this is really what we're referring to. And they are pride, pride meaning you think basically that you are better, bigger than you really are.
Okay.
Lust, which is excess desire. Anger, which again is excess feelings of anger. So one of the points that I make throughout the book is that these so-called sins are not necessarily completely taboo.
Okay.
The problem is when you engage in the activity in excess. So the next one being gluttony, which has always been related to food and drink,
Right.
and eating too much and drinking too much.
Right.
So the argument is that, you know, we have to eat, we have to drink. That's how we exist.
Yeah.
But it's when that's done in excess that it becomes sinful behavior. And then we have avarice, which is greed, and envy. And then the final one that I address in the book is sloth, which is essentially laziness, but really I think has changed in its definition in many ways for us today.
Right. So you did mention something about change, and this is one thing I wanted to ask: has the definition changed since the time these sins were, you know, for lack of a better word, codified? You know, has it changed over time, the definitions?
I don't know if the definitions of the specific sins have changed. What has changed is the context in which we discuss them. And so, for example, in the chapter on gluttony, I do look at the issue of gluttony as it relates to the eating and drinking and the obesity crisis in the United States and issues related to food and drink. But I also look at it as being a sin of excessive input of anything into your body. And so I remove that then to the world of technology and talk about us being overloaded with data. And you know, being glued to our smartphones 24/7, and that's a gluttonous behavior as well, as I see it. So I think the hardcore definitions of each of these probably pretty much has stayed the same. If you look them up in any dictionary, it would probably still fly as it did back in the 4th century for Gregory. But of course, the context has changed, and I think that's what we need to really look at.
Right. Okay. So getting back to when these 7 deadly sins were first codified, you know, when they were first put together.
Yeah.
What was the impact of these concepts on the society at the time? I mean, you did mention that these were like how do you, kind of like a summary of previous lists of sins.
Right. They're really an editing or an updating of previous lists, which had been around for quite a few centuries at the time.
Right.
The impact at the time throughout the Middle Ages in the West, of course, is completely linked to the power and authority of the church. These sins were used in a way to control people, to control people's behavior. Once we hit the Reformation and get into the Renaissance, and everything really shifts after the invention of the printing press, and people are able to make decisions for themselves, read texts for themselves, that really shifts then. The power and authority of the church over many people really was mitigated, and it became much more of an individual decision. And as I see it, as we move then into the 20th, 21st century today, that really has impacted us in a great way when it comes to questions of responsibility for our behavior.
Right. So these the concept of these 7 deadly sins, the concept of excess, then it's still, I take it then it still applies today. I mean, it's still relevant today.
Right. I believe it is. I believe that we can look at it not in a strictly theological sense. We can look at it more in a spiritual sense. And what I mean by that is one can easily be a spiritual individual and not be necessarily religious.
Right.
And I think that is certainly a trend that we have seen over the last 40 or 50 years, mostly in the West. a movement from organized religion to a type of what I kind of call smorgasbord spirituality, where people sort of pick and choose what they like and create their own belief systems.
Right, right. So this is not then as how do you how would I'd say then like as homogeneous as it used to be because the
I don't
influence of
think so.
religions. Okay,
Yeah, I think a lot of this, a lot of these sins and a lot of our behavior has really become so much more personal and personally interpreted
hmm
than it once was. As you mentioned, looking at definitions, if you go back to the Middle Ages, it was very clear what was right and what was wrong. It was a black and white issue.
right,
Today, certainly, there are a lot more many gray areas, a lot more areas where it's difficult to really decide, is that behavior, quote unquote, good or bad?
hmm
And for many people, that's come down to an individual interpretation,
okay,
which in itself is an interesting development, and of course can become incredibly dangerous in a society if
right,
we're all sort of going and doing our own thing based on what we believe is right and wrong.
hmm
But that has really occurred, and it's created an atmosphere in our culture where the question of assessing right and wrong has become much more difficult. I mean, if we just look at the news on a daily basis
right,
and
right.
what the news reports and deciding, is that wrong? Is that right? When we look at political decisions, for example.
Right. Okay, okay. So this is then I don't I don't know how to put for lack of a better word a bit of a mess then. I mean now that
Yeah,
it's come down to the individual who decides.
it is. I mean, what I think has happened is we have come to see a real split, and I don't think this is necessarily a new thing,
All right.
between our attitudes about behavior in the Western world and
hmm
our attitudes about behavior in the Eastern world.
Okay.
The Western world, we tend to look externally for assessment and approval. If
Okay.
we think about the three major Western traditions of religion, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam,
Okay.
they all look to God as an external force.
hmm
In the majority of Eastern religious traditions, Taoism, Buddhism, Hinduism, and many others, it is much more a sense that God resides within the individual. And so it is about reflection about your behavior and not looking for an external approval.
Okay. So this is also something that I want to ask you about. So you did mention about the Eastern religions, Eastern societies, and it occurs to me then that do these seven sins? I know they probably don't exist in the original form, but does some form of this kind of the seven sins exist in Eastern religions?
They do. I mean, there are different codifications of sin depending on what tradition you're looking at.
Mm,
So, I mean, Judaism, for example, does have codification of sin. I mean, it's most evident for us in something like the Ten Commandments.
right, right.
Um, but it's a different list.
Okay.
It's funny because one person said to me when they found out that I was working on this book, they said, "Oh, the Ten Commandments, then." And I said,
Uh-huh.
"Well, no, that's not the seven deadly sins. Those are two different things.
Okay.
There's some overlap, obviously, but they aren't identical.
hmm
In many of the Eastern traditions, there are delineations of sin and lists of sins. They are a bit different and looked at in a different sense. Again, it seems to me that it's more about our interaction with others
hmm
versus our interaction with ourselves, if that makes any sense. So again, it's this distinction between looking at the effect of our behavior, whether that effect is on our own spiritual being or on others.
hmm Okay. 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 So then, I mean, I guess you did answer this already in our previous conversations, but you know, nowadays in Western culture, religion is kind of like, blasé, past. I mean, no
Right.
longer, for lack of a better word, cool or the in thing. How many people do you think still believe in the concept of sin, of sin as being something that's bad?
Yeah, I think a lot of people do. I think they may have difficulty really defining it. And
Mm,
define, so many people, when you talk about the concept of the seven deadly sins, they say, oh, yeah, yeah. And then you say, okay, can you name them? And most
mm,
people
mm.
can't.
Okay.
And actually, when you talk about some of these, such as pride and avarice, there's always a request for a definition because, well, what does that mean?
Right,
Uh,
right.
and so I do think that people still embrace, for lack of another word of putting it, lack of another way of putting it, the concept of sin. It's just has become, again, much more personal and
Oh.
less communal, less about checking a list.
So it occurs to me then that, if people have their own lists of what sins are, I mean, there might be some person might have a list of, say, more than 8 sins if he thinks about it. Some people might have a list of 4 sins, things like that. So, is the concept of these seven deadly sins? Do you think it's still applicable? It's still viable insofar as people's personal morality?
Probably not as a list of seven.
Okay.
Um, and the only reason that I have the list of seven is because we do have the concept of the seven deadly sins.
All right.
To write an actual history of sin and an overview of sin would
Right.
probably be a multi-volume work,
Right.
uh,
Right.
and very difficult to do today because, again, so much of our behavior is being recategorized
Hmm.
as to what is sinful behavior versus what is not.
Yeah.
If you look at something like the Me Too movement,
Hmm.
a lot of the activity that is now looked at as being egregious slash sinful slash illegal
Hmm.
when it comes to the contact of men with women in the workplace, for example.
Hmm.
Well, 30, 40 years ago, it wasn't.
Hmm.
And so, it is, I think, a moving target, if you will.
Okay. Okay. So let me get a little basic here. I mean, the concept of sinning. Um, what is the real basis behind this? I mean, is there a broader issue behind this? Is there a more basic issue, like morally bad and stuff like that, or is there something more? Yeah.
Well, initially, it becomes a sin that you are committing against God.
Uh-huh.
So the sin is a violation of a covenant that God has made with human beings.
I see.
Eventually, though, I would argue that that develops into more of a violation of a covenant that we make with each other
Hmm.
about acceptable behavior.
Hmm.
And so it becomes less and less about, I'm offending God and more about, well, I'm offending you
I see.
because my behavior is in some ways impacting you in a negative way.
Mm. Okay. 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 I got that. Okay. So, Dr. Salomon, just asking, when you were making this book about the sins, what was the most interesting thing that you came across while you were writing or researching for this book?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think probably it is the impact that technology is having on sinful behavior today.
Uh-huh.
I saw that in so many different ways, and I try to bring that into just about every chapter in the book,
Hmm.
looking at how technology is really influencing our lives in such a negative way. And mind you, I'm not arguing for throwing out all of our cell phones. I'm not a Luddite.
All right.
Certainly use technology. You and I are talking via Skype right now, which neither one of
Right.
us had any trouble doing.
All right.
Uh,
Right.
but there certainly is a way in which the technology is getting in the way of our humanity and our human being
Mm-hmm.
and our relating to each other on that level. And I believe that in some ways that would be categorized by Gregory, if he were alive today, as being sinful behavior. It reduces our human being.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. So which kind? sorry, just to get back a little bit to
Sure.
Gregory. Yeah. So in this with Gregory's context then of creating the seven deadly sins, was his context, I take it from you, is to essentially bring out our humanity more than anything else. The
Well,
good
is
aspect is it?
looking at what makes us human
Okay.
in our relationship with God.
Oh, okay. All right. And of course nowadays more like our relationship with each other.
Exactly.
Oh, okay, okay.
Exactly.
So the entire context has really changed then. I mean,
It really has. Yes.
wow.
I mean, as we have moved from a strictly religious society
Right?
to a much more secular society,
Hmm.
the concept has changed along with that.
Mm, okay, interesting, interesting. Okay, so Dr. Salma, let's say you came across someone who's, I don't know, whom you see possibly committing one of these sins. You know, maybe texting too often or something like that. And you know, he's kind of interested in knowing about what sin is. You know, kind of curious. And
Hmm.
you had only enough time to tell that person one thing about what sin is all about. What would be that one thing you'd tell them?
I would probably use a definition that was formulated by the psychologist Carl Menninger
Mm,
in the 1970s. He wrote a book in the early 1970s, 1973, I believe it was,
right.
called Whatever Happened to Sin.
Okay.
And he
Okay.
defined sin in his book as behavior that violates the moral code or the individual conscience or both.
Hmm.
So you'll notice that in his definition, there's no mention of religion. It is
Right.
behavior that violates the moral code or the individual conscience or both.
Right.
So it speaks more to, again, us as human beings and our humanity than
Mhm.
it does about any kind of religious construction.
Okay. All right. Okay. Okay. Got that. Got that. Okay. So, Dr. Salman, in the last minute or so of this interview, are there any last words of wisdom you'd like to share, maybe to inspire listeners?
Well, I do believe that we are going down a slippery slope when it comes
Okay.
to the concept of sin
Right.
in our
Okay.
culture. And much of that, I argue in the book, has to do with our just wholesale buying into everything that is technological and fast.
Mm-hmm.
And it has gotten in the way of our ability to really engage in reflection and contemplation,
Mm-hmm.
which are important parts of human existence.
Mm-hmm.
And without those, I think that it just continues to really take away more and more of our humanity.
Okay. Okay. All right. So, got that. Got that. Okay. All right then. So, in closing, then, the book is The Seven Deadly Sins: How Sin Influenced the West from the Middle Ages to the Modern Era. The author's our guest, Dr. David A. Salomon, and you can find his book on such websites as Amazon. So, Dr. Salomon, thank you very much for being an author story. Thank you very much for enlightening us on this very interesting topic.
Thanks so much. It was great talking with you.
Cool. So, everyone, check out The Seven Deadly Sins. And for a gander at more awesome authors and great books, be sure to subscribe to our channel. So, see you all next time on Author Story, where we speak to another great author about another awesome book.